Hello, everyone. I'm Maliheh Paryavi, and this is the Dr. Maliheh Paryavi podcast. I'm honored to bring you real conversations with my amazing guests who are inspiring women leaders and pioneers. Join us as we explore how to live our best lives, become authentic and impactful leaders, and transform the world both within and around us. Our journey together begins right now. I'm so honored to be speaking with Ms. Tina Chen, President and CEO of Time's Up Now and the Time's Up Foundation, which are taking on the important mission of building a world without sexual harassment and building workplaces that are safe, fair, and dignified for everyone. Ms. Chen, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
It's wonderful to have you here. And I want to start by sharing a statistic with our audience so we're all reminded of the reality in which we live in. Up to 85% of women in the United States report having experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. Let's let that sink in a little bit for our audience. So if more than 8 out of 10 women say they have been harassed at work, it's likely that one of us or someone we know has experienced this. And not surprisingly, studies have shown that workplace sexual harassment severely impacts individuals' economic, physical, and mental health and well-being. And in addition to the rampant sexual harassment, women also face lack of paid leave, inaccessible and expensive childcare, a pay gap, not to mention pregnancy and caregiver discrimination. So when you think about it, Ms. Chen, in an ideal situation, your job is essentially to make sure the 85% becomes 0% and stays there, and all of these other challenges are remedied. That is a huge undertaking.
Well, it is. It is. And just to put a finer point on it, that statistic that you cite isn't from an advocacy group. It comes from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, from a survey that they did during the Obama administration in 2015. And to be clear with folks, one of the things I think that's happened post Harvey Weinstein is everybody's image in their heads of sexual harassment is that most extreme form, the kind of sexual harassment that is essentially a criminal act of sexual assault or physical assault. But you know what? Sexual harassment is a broad range of behaviors, right? It extends from that most serious form to the sort of microaggressions that so many of us experience, right? The dirty jokes that are told in the office or asking somebody out for a date. One extreme and the other extreme is excluding women from the dinner meetings with the client, or, doing evaluations differently, asking people, personal questions about their personal life that are inappropriate, having inappropriate imagery around, an office, right? Or on somebody's computer. And it happens online too. People also think it needs to be in person, but we are seeing, increasingly in this remote working situation that you can sexually harass people, in the Zoom chat that's happening, right? The direct messaging part, or at night when somebody is calling somebody at all hours of the night as a manager. So, these are the many forms that women are experiencing, which, a lot of women at some point in their careers have done, no matter what your job is, right? It covers all industries. It happens in white collar professional settings. It happens in restaurants. We did a survey together with One Fair Wage at the end of the year last year, just before Christmas, of hospitality workers that found that, 40% of hospitality workers had seen an increase of sexual harassment during the pandemic, with things like restaurant goers, saying to these workers who exist on tips, remember, right, which is a whole other topic we can get into about tipped minimum wage, but they exist on tips, and restaurant workers saying to them things like, pull your mask down so I can see what you look like so I know how much to tip you. Or even more vulgarly, pull your mask down so I can stick my tongue in your mouth so I know how much to tip you. Those are actual things that have actually been said during a pandemic to restaurant workers who are working hard, right, to actually get food on the table, to sort of serve people essential food during a pandemic.
This is obviously so pervasive, and I grew up in an environment that promoted gender segregation and where it clearly assumed and often explicitly stated that if women interact with men, they will get harassed and assaulted. And in this context, the solution that was often provided was just hide the women from the men. I grew up so much in my life feeling frustrated by this. Like, can there really be no other solution than hiding women from the men? And the threat of sexual harassment to this day is used to keep women from studying in fields and working in careers that they're passionate about, from traveling, and from having full lives as equal beings on this earth, deserving of safety and security and equal opportunities to thrive. And believe it or not, I've heard the events of the Me Too movement and the sexual harassment statistics from the US being used in an attempt to validate these views, saying, see what's happening to women in the West. This is what happens when women go to work. This is why women need to stay home. We're just trying to protect you guys. And what do you say to these individuals?
Well, the answer is actually quite the opposite, right? And so the reason why, to go back to your opening, our mission at Time's Up is not just to fight for survivor justice, which we do, but, we don't just want to pick up the pieces after sexual harassment occurs. We're fighting for workplaces where it doesn't happen in the first place. And the solution there actually is not to keep women out of the workplace. It's actually to bring more women into the workplace and more people of color, more LGBTQIA, more disabled workers. The more we diversify our workplaces up and down the wage scale, right? Not just in entry-level positions, but all the way up to the C-suite, so that they are in decision-making positions, the more you will create an equitable environment. Because in order to build those kinds of workplaces, you have to have a workplace culture, right, that won't tolerate sexual harassment, that will be inclusive of everyone, whoever they are, with their whole selves being able to come to work, and will allow everyone to reach their full potential. If you segregate the workforce, this is what happens in those societies that are excluding women from full participation in their economies or in the life of the country, is that doesn't mean sexual aggression goes away, right? It's just not happening in those particular segregated environments. It's going to play itself out in other environments when women are on buses, as we've seen, or women are in their own homes or other places on the street. It will still happen. It just means we don't actually have a way to create a culture where women are seen as equal, where they're treated as equal, where they have the same economic opportunities. And we also know that by keeping women out of our economies, by not allowing women to complete their education, we are actually making societies more insecure, right? I did a lot of work with Mrs. Obama, for example, when I was in the White House on adolescent girls' education. It was a passion of both of ours. And our last initiative she launched was Let Girls Learn in 2014. And one of the reasons we did that was the World Bank, the State Departments of both parties, Republican and State Departments and Democratic State Departments, have all concluded that one of the surest ways to address issues of poverty, health, economic prosperity in a country, one of the surest ways to address those ills is to educate the women and girls of a country. Right, whole GDP will go up if you increase the number of women and girls who are graduating from 12 years of education. And the same is true in the United States. The more women who are in decision-making positions in companies, who are up and down the wage scale, the more successful companies are going to be. The Wall Street Journal published a story a couple of months ago that actually looked at the Russell, index of what successful companies are. And the one consistent thing they found between companies that hit the mark on profitability, on, their all the different metrics, was how many women they had in their leadership, right? That was the consistent variable across the board, from the companies that scored at the top of the index to ones who scored at the bottom of the index. So that's how we know that actually the opposite, to your point, is true. This is not about excluding women to keep them safe. This is about including women in all facets of a workplace. And that overall is not only just good for women, as that Russell Index study shows you, it's good for the companies, right? It will help our overall economy get better and stronger and more sustainable. You will have access to the entire talent pool of our country instead of just half the talent pool. And in a moment where knowledge is power in the economy, increasingly all of our economies are getting fueled on creativity and knowledge. You're going to want that access to that talent. And that's why you see so many CEOs actually embracing this issue now in ways that I've never seen them embrace it before.
I totally agree that we need women to be included and they need to have equal rights and equal opportunities, and we need more women in leadership. And I've seen so many individuals, especially women, though, pass up on leadership opportunities because of the burden of responsibility they felt they would have. And I truly can't imagine a responsibility greater than what you've taken on, which is working to ensure the safety and equity of basically half of the world's population against deeply entrenched systemic forces and generations of conditioning, which in a way also requires championing deep healing for all of us. So, my question to you is, as a leader, what made you want to take this on?
Well, like all things, I'm not sure you necessarily ever set out to take it on, but it comes to you. In some ways, it came to me, my own personal history is I sort of learned about a lot of feminist issues very early on after graduating college and getting married. I moved to Springfield, Illinois, and which is our state capital. And all of a sudden, this is 1978, found myself in the middle of the national fight to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States and to make, gender rights as formally part of our Constitution. Illinois we only had 3 states left to get over the number that you needed to get in the Constitution. And Illinois was the only northern industrial state that had not ratified the ERA. So we were like the center of American feminism. Every feminist leader was here. We had 100,000 person marches down the streets of Chicago. We had nuns on hunger strikes, to make the point. It was a very heady time to be in my early 20s and witnessing all of this. I really learned how to be an organizer in that moment and a lot about gender discrimination and women's rights. And so that kind of set me on a path to continue working on these issues. And then, I went to law school and then spent 2 decades as a single working mom at a big corporate law firm, which I loved. I loved being a lawyer, but I saw the struggles of being a single working mom. And I had the resources of being a lawyer at a big law firm, and it was still hard, right? And I could always thought how much more exponentially difficult this would be if I were getting paid minimum wage, right? Or if I were, in another position. And so many of our single working moms are in that position. Something like 2/3 of America's children either live in a household where both parents work or one parent works. It's a single working family. So, these issues of caregiving and balancing home and work are things I've lived and are pretty key. And then when I went to the White House, it was key for me as a single working mom. Valerie Jarrett, she was the chair and I was the executive director of the White House Council of Women and Girls. So we worked on these issues together. Valerie was a single working mom her entire career. And the Obamas themselves had been 2 working parents of young children when they entered the White House. So among the 4 of us, we acutely felt these issues and that balance. And so we worked on a whole working families agenda during the 8 years. We held the first ever White House summit on working families to address these issues. We tried to get them passed through Congress, but you may recall for politics that the Democrats lost the Congress after the first 2 years. And so in the remaining 6 years of our 2 terms, we could not get things, even basic things like more equal pay protections passed. And so instead, we reached out to companies to talk to them about it. That's what the Working Families Summit was about. And I learned through there that companies were way ahead of our public policymakers. They were starting to see the value in investing in their workforce and adopting these policies. And so when I left the White House, started a practice at a law firm that actually helped companies do this work, right? And advised them on how to build better workplace cultures, because companies already, before Harvey Weinstein, were sort of seeing how that benefited them. And then the Harvey Weinstein moment happened in the fall of 2017. And then companies really saw, not only is this good for my bottom line, but if I don't address it and I have a toxic workplace culture in my company, then it could bring the whole company down. The Weinstein companies went bankrupt. Les Moonves, the CEO of CBS, went under, and then CBS was acquired by Viacom. I mean, those are the kinds of things that can happen if you let a toxic workplace culture just fester within your company. And now I will say, just to put a final closing on it, being at Time's Up, I came to Time's Up for my practice in November of 2019 because I thought we were at a transformational moment, right, where companies saw these issues like never before. And I will say over the course of the last year during the pandemic, that has become even more true because what we have seen in the pandemic is all these struggles that women have had for generations in the workplace are now revealed for everybody to see. Because guess what? Their husbands are home watching the struggle with caring for kids who are out of school while trying to be on Zoom meetings. Company leaders and CEOs are finding that they can't, even when they do reopen their workplaces, they can't get enough workers to show up on their manufacturing floors because their workers are telling them that they've got caregiving responsibilities at home. So even more than before, we know and can see what a toll this is taking. Nearly 5 million women have left the workforce since the start of the pandemic. Women's labor force participation is at the lowest levels that we've seen since the 1980s. So we are running the risk of actually undoing all the gains that we've made if we don't address these really key issues around caregiving and the structural barriers that are keeping women from succeeding in the workforce.
Obviously, you're someone who's deeply passionate about these issues, but I shared with you before we started recording, just preparing for this episode was a very emotionally taxing exercise for me because this is such an important topic. It touches people, it touches yourself. How do you sustain your energy to keep going?
I guess what keeps me going are several things. One is in the present moment, I really do see an opportunity here. One of my colleagues just described it as a once in a century opportunity. We really do. We have an opportunity right now because of the awareness of the pandemic, because, the new Biden administration has been talking about investing right in these structural solutions, not just doing a patchwork to get our economy to recover, but really rebuilding our economy better so that it better addresses workers. So they are putting forward proposals to really build a care economy infrastructure. And by that, I mean like from childcare through elder care, paid leave, supports for caregivers. So what keeps me going is this opportunity, this historic opportunity if we push things through. I have some perspective on this too. So I'm cognizant when you say how big is the issue and how large it is. It bears remembering that gender discrimination is one of the things that has been with us forever. I mean, if you think about it, right? Gender discrimination has transcended religion and race and geography and time, right? It goes back in time through millennia. Those are the kinds of gender norms we are fighting against. And yet we are slowly making progress, right? I was able to rise to become a partner at a large law firm, to be an assistant to the president of the United States, as a woman of color, as the daughter of immigrants to the United States. That in one generation in my family, my parents went from two students as immigrants, as refugees, really fleeing China, post World War II China in 1949, in a single generation to their daughter going back to China, right, as an assistant to the president, representing the president, first lady of the United States. So progress can happen, right? So I know it from my own story. I see it sort of around us. And then my own personality is I tend to sort of look at some of the statistics and look at it's sort of probably the corporate litigator in me. My reaction is less frustration and sadness and more just anger. So I get fueled a lot just by the anger of the moment, and how do we change things?
Well, I'm so glad you're in this fight and trying to change things. And I couldn't agree more that we need to level the playing field and increase the representation of women in leadership positions, and how amazing it is that now we have a Madam Vice President. Let's let that sink in too, because we have been making progress, and I do think education is key. I do think having women in leadership is definitely key. But something that I've come to learn, and it is what led me to become an advisor for women in leadership, is when I realized that having more women in leadership is not necessarily enough, that we need to also make sure that they have the support to truly thrive in these positions and be given safe spaces to resolve technical as well as leadership challenges and find their own authentic way of creating change in the world. And I can't even begin to tell you the number of women leaders I've talked to that have said that they feel like they can't make any mistakes. They don't have anyone to go to for advice or for help if they're stuck on a challenge, that they feel everyone is just waiting for them to fail, that they face constant scrutiny for not just their performance and leadership, but how they dress and their hair. And we see that all too often play out in the media when they criticize presidential candidates and political candidates. And they also scrutinize themselves a lot and place really high expectations on themselves. So we need to make sure that we aren't just talking about increasing the number of women in leadership, but also about truly supporting them to remove any internal as well as external barriers they may have to shine in these positions. And as a women leader yourself, have you dealt with any of these challenges? And what advice do you have for women leaders, especially those in positions facing really high stakes?
Absolutely. Those are all those sentiments that you laid out. I've heard before. I've experienced them myself. My practice for 2 decades at a large law firm was in a top tier corporate setting, really working with Fortune 100 companies, with boards of directors, with investment bankers. And more often than not, I was the only woman in the room and the only person of color in the room. And, that can be daunting, right? I think, my biggest piece of advice, though, when you get to that state is not to let it get you inside your head, right? You can be that only person in the room, and there are the slights that will happen. There are the jokes that will happen. There are, the people who try to get advantage and get inside your head that will happen. But don't let it get inside your head. Like, use it. I used to do a thing. One of my tactics were, when people would see me coming in to be the person taking somebody's deposition, to sort of take evidence on a witness in a big case. And you just knew they just thought I didn't know what I was talking about because I, was an Asian woman coming in to do this. It was to use it. My shtick was always to be, well, I didn't really get that. Do you think you could explain that more to me? And when you do that, you would be amazed at the white men who fall over themselves to tell the pretty little lady what to do and how they completely then incriminate themselves as they're doing it. Because the guard comes down, they're not really paying attention and protecting themselves on what they're saying. They make all sorts of admissions about things that they shouldn't be that I could use later. It was kind of effective. And it's a good thing I'm not litigating now because now the secret's out of the bag. But that is, it was, and look, if that's the way you're going to think about me, then I'm going to use that, right? And I can use it to my advantage, is to think of things, sort of that way, and then pushing against it. It would have been more detrimental to me to try to know that feeling was happening in the room and try to correct it in the room and reassert it, right? It's like, I don't need to do that. They'll just know I was smart enough when we get to trial, and I just slay them with all of this material you just gave me, which happened on more than one occasion. And it's a very satisfying moment, obviously, when that happens. But everybody's different. So the other piece of advice I would give is what worked for me may or may not work for you, right? Or for another person. I mean, it is, a lot of this is finding your own voice, trusting that voice when you find it. So don't let somebody else critique veer you away from what you know is authentic to yourself. And then use what is authentic to you. If being funny is not for you, then don't be funny. Don't try to be funny. If being angry and assertive is not for you, then don't do that. Do the thing that works for you, because that's what you'll be most comfortable with, and it will shine through. People ask me about my old boss, Mrs. Obama, all the time. And what I say about her is, look, she is the exact same person behind closed doors as she is in front of the camera. And that authenticity is something she feels deeply about. She pushed for when she was first lady, because when you become first lady of the United States, there's all sorts of expectations and images that other people have in their heads for what a first lady should look like and what a first lady should do. And she was the first Black first lady in the country, right? And she fought very hard to make sure whenever she appeared and whatever she did and said was authentic to her and to what she believed and her values. And I think that's why she, was as successful as she was as first lady, why she remains as popular as she is, because people respond to and can see that authenticity. And I think a big part of the journey that young women in the workplace should go through is figuring that out, no matter what level you are, what kind of job you've got, figuring out what works for you in your life and then sticking to that path. when others try to take you off it is one of the keys.
I think we also need to be self compassionate and be kinder to ourselves. I actually just released an episode with Dr. Kristen Neff, who is a pioneer researcher in the field of self compassion, talking about how just being kind to yourself and taking the kindness we give so easily to other people and turning it towards ourselves and creating that internal safety can really help us thrive, and also honoring our needs and taking breaks when we need to, taking care of ourselves as much as we can. I think as women, we need to remind ourselves a lot. I have to remind myself, and I remind all my girlfriends, but it's amazing how we're so good at being compassionate towards other people, but when we want to turn it to ourselves, it's such a huge challenge. And I do think that is an important part of it.
Oh, absolutely. No, women, we are absolutely not. We do not take the time for ourselves, right? And we do not give ourselves the space and permission. That self-care and self-kindness is absolutely true. Believe me, I'm not good at it myself. So self-care is not one of my strong suits, as my old boss used to tell me. So,
But we're all works in progress, and
that's
there's
right.
never too late to start.
That's right. That's right.
um, Obviously, I'm so glad that you're doing the work you're doing, and we're all rooting for your success. And my hope is that through this podcast, we can inspire more people to get involved and create positive change, because unfortunately, the lack of safety in the workplace is such a pervasive issue that we all have a role in protecting one another and supporting one another. And that includes men and women. And this is especially because the new Time's Up research shows that more than 7 in 10 survivors who experience workplace sexual harassment also face some form of retaliation when coming forward, including termination, being sued for defamation, and being denied promotions. And sadly, I don't find this statistic surprising. I wish it wasn't this way, but I would expect that when a workplace is unsafe enough for harassment to occur, it would likely still be unsafe enough to allow for subsequent retaliation to occur. So perhaps sexual harassment and subsequent punishment and retaliation and the lack of safety for women are just symptoms of something deeper. So, given your experience in this field, do you have any insights you can share with us about what may be the root causes of these issues?
I think you're right. They are symptoms. They are symptoms of what I would say happens when you have a toxic workplace culture, right? Because if that level of sexual harassment is happening, of retaliation is happening, you're likely having other forms of discrimination occur. You likely don't have a lot of women or other diverse workers in your leadership and in your management. You likely aren't promoting them. You're not hiring them. You may actually have an equal pay problem. I mean, all of these issues get linked together as both the structural issues, like how much you're paying people, that feed into the kind of overall culture that you have in a company. I will also say that if you've got sexual harassment happening, you may well have lots of other things happening, because if you are not protecting your workers and you're not supporting them, then, let's say you're a bank, and we've seen this happen in big banks and elsewhere. Maybe your workers are saying, well, hell, if they're not like listening to the employment laws and protecting me, then I'm going to go out and pad my, reach out to customers, and we're going to have, consumer fraud that's happening on a bigger scale, or other things, because you've got a culture where laws and rights and workers are not respected or supported. On the flip side, if you can build a better culture where your workers are engaged and employed, where they feel heard and seen with the issues that they have, you're providing them paid sick leave and paid family leave, you're helping them. What we know is then worker productivity actually goes up, right? When that happens, worker absenteeism goes down, worker turnover goes down. So all of these investments in your workforce in the long run, instead of costing you money, actually has a huge payoff and benefit in keeping your workforce productive and long-term, and building the relationships and becoming, more productive for you over time, and allowing you to weather the kinds of circumstances we're under right now, like the crises of the pandemic. If companies had invested in their workforces and had paid sick leave at the start of the pandemic, think how much better we would be. We are the only industrialized country in the world. We're one of only 2 in the world that doesn't have some form of paid family leave on the books. We don't. We have an emergency leave that was cobbled together in the pandemic, sick leave, and it leaves out millions of workers anyway. And we don't have anything permanent. It's one of the things we've been pushing for in the recovery package, is to make sure we pass paid permanent sick leave and family leave in this country. For the first time, it's 2021, and we need it for the first time ever. So, those are the kinds of things that are the structural issues that are all interconnected that lead to things like sexual harassment and retaliation happening. And it's short-sighted to think, and this is the way we used to treat sexual harassment. So it bears remembering that sexual harassment has been unlawful for over 3 decades in the United States, right? It's been that long. And before the Harvey Weinstein reporting happened in the fall of 2017, every major company in America had a sexual harassment policy. And they did sexual harassment trainings because that was kind of what the law, sort of said. And yet they all read the same. They were defined by the legal definition of sexual harassment, which is, oh, by the way, a really low bar for bad behavior, right? And didn't really talk about culture, didn't really come from a place, let's see how do we value each other as coworkers and workers, and start from a place there rather than just legal compliance to the lowest common denominator definition of the law. And so that's what we need to change. And companies did that. So I will say post Harvey Weinstein, there's been a real change in the kinds of way policies work and the trainings, and more states have required training, including things like training for bystanders. But you can't just solve sexual harassment by doing that, by just changing your policy and doing some more trainings and then think you're done and it's going to stop. Because the root causes, as you point out, to get back to the question, is all these other issues that lead to whether you've got a respectful culture, a safe, fair, and dignified workplace culture, which is also evidenced by how many women and people of color and LGBTQIA and disabled workers you're promoting, you're hiring, you're retaining, whether that message is coming from the C-suite, whether your board of directors is enforcing it and expecting that kind of culture from the management. That's what it takes.
And the workplace also doesn't exist in isolation of the rest of society. So what we're noticing in the workplace could also be a symptom of what's going on in our society in terms of not really seeing women as equal and not respecting them as equal beings.
Well, of course. I mean, that is overall, the symptom that we've got and need to address. But all of these issues, again, are sort of interrelated, right? So how we see women in leadership, how we see women succeeding in the workplace, whether there are women CEOs or not. Remember, again, it's 2021 and women are still only 7.5%, I think, of Fortune 500 CEOs. Up until 2 weeks ago, there were no Black women CEOs. We now have one, with Roz Brewer's appointment to be the CEO of Walgreens. One. One out of 500 companies, in the top 500 companies in the United States. It's one of the reasons, actually, during the 2020 election, Time's Up, together with about 300 other organizations and leaders, we led a effort called We Have Her Back, hashtag We Have Her Back, where we were at Time's Up monitoring all the coverage of for Vice President Kamala Harris and several key women politicians running for election in both the Republican and Democratic parties, and tried to immediately call out any sort of sexist, racist, misogynistic reporting on their, candidacies that we saw. We had over, I think 130,000 news articles written, mentioned in 850,000 different, social media posts that reached 15 billion people. And the reason we did it wasn't just because it was important in the electoral sphere to address these kinds of attacks on women leaders, is that how those women leaders in such a public space were perceived, and as pervasive as public commentary is, right, on our airwaves, it infects how we see women leaders everywhere, right? So if Kamala Harris can be called sort of some of the vulgar names she was called in mainstream media, then the waitress who was restaurant server who aspires to manage the restaurant she works in, that owner is going to look at her leadership colored by that kind of viewpoint, right? About the kinds of things that were being said about women leaders on the airways, on CNN at night, on, pick your news outlet. And that's why we felt it was really important in that moment when so much focus was on women leadership to call it out when instead of talking about her issues, you're talking about the clothes she wears or who she used to date, all of which was talked about with Kamala Harris, or, using vulgar names to talk about her gender or her race. We need to address those issues everywhere they occur because, our kids are hearing them. It colors how they think about women as leaders. And our bosses and CEOs are hearing it, and it affects how they think about their own women who are working in the workplace.
I mean, I do think a big part of that is obviously changing the culture that we have as a society and also in the workplace. But we need to also educate ourselves and also change the culture of the workforce and the pipeline of workforce in schools and on college campuses. I used to be a resident advisor when I was a PhD student at Harvard. I lived in one of the undergraduate dorms. And one of the most painful experiences I had was having to show up in the middle of the night for a student that was raped. And I was shivering and shaking on the inside, trying to keep myself calm and be there for the student. I still to this day can't fathom what my student was going through. But these things are happening before people enter into the workforce. They're happening on high schools, and children are being conditioned to think of men, girls and boys and women and men differently at a young age. So what can we do to change the culture earlier and not just once they're in the workplace and going company by company, but do we need a more holistic way of looking at just how can we create sustainable shifts?
Well, I can answer that in two ways. One from Time's Up and another just for me personally. So Time's Up, where we have really, to your point about it's a really big issue, a big field. So we have concentrated our work on the workplace, right? So knowing that there's so much else out there, one of our focal points has been to try to change it, at least in the workplace. But we are also working on culture change when we talk about changing in the workplace, because you're right. Things like women's leadership, like I talked about with We Have Her Back, we need to change the overall culture. That's why I'm so proud of the fact that, we have a lot of creative folks that are part of our founding because we were founded out of the entertainment community. And, those entertainment leaders have stayed with us over the course of the last 3 years, actively involved with Time's Up. And they're the people who make culture in our country, and it's little things like making sure, that on Blackish, that Rainbow and Tracy Ellis Ross's character isn't the only person unloading the dishwasher, right? That sometimes Anthony Edwards is also unloading the dishwasher, right? And doing that kind of culture changing work. So that's part of what we are doing at Time's Up, but we've sort of, again, as I said, stayed in our workplace. When I was separately at the White House, obviously concerned about sexual assault among students, which is prevalent, was a huge part of my work and remains a personal passion of mine. The statistic, which we knew during the Obama administration and tried to respond to, and it has stayed the same since we left office, is that 1 out of 4 students in college will experience sexual assault before they graduate. So during that 4-year period, over 25% of our college students in the United States right now are going to be sexually assaulted during those 4 years. It's a horrific statistic. My daughter was going to college while we were in the White House. And so, that is why one of the things we did in the Obama administration was to issue guidance to all of the federally funded colleges, universities, and high schools, in the country, which are pretty much all of them, to say that under the existing Title IX law, right, which is the longstanding federal statute prohibiting gender discrimination in federally funded educational institutions, that under Title IX, that required schools to have a process and a system in place that protected students from sexual assault, that did training on it, and that adjudicated and protected students when sexual assaults occurred. We issued that actually in 2011, so 2 years into the administration. In 2013, right after the reelect, a group of students came to us, and we had thought actually the schools would listen to us and they would implement, our guidance. And we had students come to us from Ivy League schools, from across the country, big state schools, and those students really courageously came to us as survivors of sexual assault after our guidance had been issued and told us horrific stories of how they had been treated by their colleges and universities, including, for example, the alma maters of many of us who were sitting around the table. We were horrified, that they went forward to their college and college would say things like, well, if you don't feel safe, you can withdraw from school this semester. And oh, by the way, we're not going to actually return your tuition, right? Instead of dealing with the perpetrator. So that led us, under then Vice President Biden's leadership, to create the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault, which brought in the Department of Justice and the Department of Education. We even brought in Department of HHS because CDC has a lot of the best trauma-informed care research and information. The Department of Defense was there because the military academies was having the same problem, to have really a whole of government effort to address this. And we were making headway. And it was hard. Some of the schools were having trouble, and we had kind of a backlash of students who were getting disciplined, who were alleged perpetrators, saying that they weren't, weren't getting fair due process. And we were saying, well, actually, you're not entitled to go to that school. So it's different. But we were working our way through that. Sadly, in the next administration, under President Trump, Secretary Betsy DeVos reversed course and really issued sort of new rules last year. She issued them on a Friday in the middle of a pandemic when students were off campus and out of school, a set of rules to actually basically undo it, what we did in terms of protections for survivors, and extend more protections to alleged perpetrators to make it more difficult to actually address sexual assault on campus. I know, just because I know now President Biden and I know what he has done and how passionately he feels about this issue, that I'm confident that one of the things that his Department of Education is going to do is going to start to reverse that and reverse that rule, reverse that trend, and go back to now a moment where we can help students and we can help colleges and universities extend the protections that they need to students to do what you point out, right? Which is to start addressing these issues way before we get to workplace issues as students start their careers.
That's great to hear. And thank you so much for all your efforts. And in addition to changing the culture and changing companies, and there are also efforts to change laws and policies, as you have pointed to. I'm wondering if Time's Up is also working with multilateral international organizations such as the World Bank to address their workplace issues. I worked for the World Bank for many years, and thankfully, I always felt safe with my colleagues and never had any issues with harassment while I was working there. But a very dear friend of mine wasn't so lucky, and she faced harassment by her manager while they were traveling for work on World Bank mission. And she was so scared that she left the hotel and had to buy her own flight back to the US, because to make any changes to your travel plans, you would need to get manager and internal approval. And she didn't want to have to deal with this person. So she just booked her flight and got herself out of there. And when she got back, not only did she not receive justice and was not even heard, but she felt victimized and abused multiple times over by the institution in what she felt was an attempt to silence her. And given that these entities lack legislative reach of any jurisdiction, really, what can be done to hold these international organizations accountable?
Well, that's a really good point. I mean, the broader point that you're making is like, this is not confined to one sector, to one industry. This isn't only happening in the entertainment industry. It's not only happening in for-profit companies. For example, we just saw the CEO of United Way have to step down finally after women were speaking out. At Time's Up, we've been working and speaking out about what's going on in the National Football League, especially with the Washington football team, where the owner, Dan Snyder, has been accused multiple by, over 24 employees for the culture that's going on in there. So this is everywhere. We've seen not-for-profits, in the multilateral space and in the international space have the same sorts of issues. We at Time's Up aren't specifically working with multilateral organizations, although we continue to support survivors everywhere we can. But you are absolutely right there. There's a lot of places where the legal structure is inadequate, right? Even in the places where there are laws in the United States, our federal laws in the United States are completely inadequate. As I said, the definition for bad behavior is really low. We don't protect, for example, under federal law, bystanders, people who speak out on behalf of their colleagues. Those folks can be fired with impunity under, U.S. federal law. And we've got states that have tried to make changes, but that's a patchwork there, let alone internationally, right? And what goes on in other countries and what is happening with multilateral organizations that exist outside of the law. So what we say is, we are trying to build safe, fair, and dignified workplaces by changing culture, companies, and laws, right? It really has to happen on all fronts. Laws are only going to get us so far. And even if we were to pass laws, you wind up in the legislative process on getting to the lowest common denominator for what you can get passed. So it may not be as broad protections. And I say this to companies and to employers, whether it's a not-for-profit or a for-profit. As an employer, you can set the culture that you want, right? You have the power to set your own work rules. You don't have to be limited by the legal definitions, and you should aspire to do that. You should really aspire. The World Bank, for example, it's supposed to be the development bank for the world. It's supposed to lift people out of poverty and out of misery. And the idea that you do not carry that values internally, right? You're not starting internally by having a place where everyone is valued. And, that's what you need to start from. And increasingly, we are seeing, especially with this generation of millennials and Gen Z, right? They are paying attention. They are paying attention to the disconnect between what companies say their values are and how they actually act on them. So you see places like Google where the employees do the Google walkout, despite what Google says publicly, or people are starting to, make decisions, buying decisions, right? And where they want to go to work based upon the values and whether those companies are living out their values. And so that kind of external pressure and getting companies and institutions like the World Bank to do the right thing, not because the law is compelling them to do it, but because their own stature in the community at large is going to be impaired if they don't, is sort of what we need to do.
Yeah, and despite my friend's relentless and brave attempts, she was never heard. And I feel that it's the least I can do to use this opportunity to share a message she has for employers in leadership positions. I talked to her last week in preparation for this conversation and asked her, "Do you have a message you want to share? Send it to me, and I'll try to incorporate it in this podcast and to also share with you." And so here it goes. She writes, "Learn to walk in the shoes of the victims. Equip yourself with the capacity for compassion and empathy towards another human being who has been violated in this way. The paradigm of employers is to assume the perpetrator innocent until proven otherwise. It is a very lopsided frame of thinking that views the victim in only the most suspicious frame from the onset. Employers, especially male employers, need to take off their organizational hats and ask themselves the question, if this had happened to my mother, to my sister, to my wife, to my daughter, how would I manage the situation to keep them safe, to keep them protected, and to seek justice for them?"
Beautiful. I mean, absolutely. She is completely spot on to what happens and what needs to be done and what needs to change. And employers need to stop looking at the legal definitions and the legal bottom line and think, what do you want to stand for? What is the culture and the values that really are at the heart of your mission? Especially think about it someplace like the World Bank. But it's not just somebody like the World Bank that has that mission to be the development agency. It is also somebody like Google who wants to just be a search engine that sells products. You still don't want to be a company that doesn't stand for respect and fairness and safety and dignity. And if you do not treat survivors in the way in which your friend has eloquently laid out, that's what you're essentially saying to your workforce and to the broader world, is that you're not a company that believes in safety and respect and dignity and equity. And part of what we're trying to do at Time's Up is sort of call that out, both call out the positives on how you can do it, and when it doesn't happen, hold people accountable.
A crucial part of the success is also partnering with men, not just to have them on board as sympathetic allies, but as engaged and vocal partners and champions for this cause. What advice do you have for men who are in leadership positions?
Absolutely, we need men. Look, if, men are, sort of 93, 94% of the Fortune 500 CEOs, we're not going to get anywhere if those men aren't engaged in this process. And more men want to be. I've heard plenty of CEOs tell me that they're actually nervous about what to say because they don't want to misstep. And I have to say, actually enter into it. Don't be nervous about saying the wrong thing. If you say the wrong thing, apologize and move forward, but learn about it and set the tone at the top. This is as critical to the success of your company as the latest technology you're investing in. You need to set the standards and the tone for the culture that you want. You need to invest in it. You need to measure it and call out, when somebody doesn't have any women in leadership in their division, right? And understand why that's happening. Ask for those statistics. Your board of directors should be reviewing it at every moment. And to learn about it, finally, there are plenty of ways to learn about how, racism and sexism. We've had a moment here in the United States post George Floyd's murder of a racial reckoning. And, these are linked. The patriarchy that exists that has really kept women in these positions is directly linked to sort of the racism and the structural racism that exists in so many institutions. And you need to sort of learn about the history, learn about the data that's going on in your own company real time, and work at it and keep at it and speak out about it, because it is, again, as critical to the success of your company as anything else that you're doing at your company.
And I also think it's critical for our success as human species. I do feel like it's important to remember that putting gender aside, putting race aside, we're all human beings. We all have the same needs and desires, and we all have hopes and dreams, and it's a human right. Of course, we have to make the economic case and the political case and the value creation case. But feeling safe at work and having equal opportunity, it should be the case for everyone, regardless of their demographic descriptions.
You just said the words of a great woman leader, who coined the phrase, now I get over 25 years ago when then First Lady Hillary Clinton went to Beijing and sort of declared that women's rights are human rights. Exactly what you just said. Women's rights are human rights. President Obama often said was that you can judge how successful a country is by how well they treat their women and girls, and are they giving their women and girls equal opportunity and investing in them and in their success? Because women's success is integrally key to sort of the success and stability of countries, individual countries, and our sort of global peace and security.
And I just wanted to wrap up by asking you, what is your vision for Time's Up going forward? Given that we are in this historic moment, given that we are in the middle of a pandemic and a new administration has just come through, what is your vision and what do you hope to accomplish going forward with Time's Up?
Well, my immediate vision right now is, as I said earlier, I believe we are in a transformational moment, meaning there's more awareness on these issues than ever before. There's an opportunity with an administration who understands the need for a comprehensive, deep structural reform to the way our workplaces work so that we're investing in workers, not actually trying to limit our expenditures on workers. And businesses, right? We've got an historic opportunity where businesses are seeing their self-interest for the first time in ways they never had before. So, over the course of the next several months, this is truly a once-in-a-century opportunity to make that transformational change. So we're going to be pushing hard at Time's Up to do that. I want to actually encourage all of your listeners, if they are interested, you can join us by texting the word NOW, just NOW, to 30644. So it's the word NOW to 30644, and you'll get linked to all of our assets and how to stay involved, how to, work on things like We Have Her Back, or on caregiving, or on survivor justice, that whole panoply of interconnected issues that need to be addressed for us really to realize gender equity in this country in this moment. I'm optimistic. I really do think we could see transformational change. This can be the moment, when we will look back on and not only just see ourselves coming out of this horrible pandemic, but see ourselves coming out of the pandemic in a New Deal kind of way with a whole new understanding about what the way our workplaces ought to operate and how women and people of color and disabled workers and LGBTQIA workers should be included and respected and elevated and allowed to reach their full potential. So I really believe this can be that transformational moment, and I hope that everyone will join us in that work.
I hope so too. Thank you so much. I can't thank you enough for making the time to speak with me on this podcast, given all these immense missions you have and responsibilities you have. Thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Maliheh Parawi podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please stay safe and well and keep on shining.